Hello everyone. Today we will be focusing on the physical, cognitive, and language development during infancy. And to start us off with, we talk about sex differences in physical development and growth. And so in terms of differences of physical development across sexes, girls are about 4 to 6 weeks ahead in skeletal maturity than are boys at birth. And a month doesn't seem like a big difference. However, the gap widens so much by that age 12, girls' skeletal maturity outreaches boys by 2 years. And generally, during this period, we can observe great changes in children's physical development through their proportions. In their physical development, children first invest most of their growing from head to tail, which is known as cephalocaudal. And for infants and toddlers, their motivation to move are adaptive in developing their physicality and also their mobility. So certain behaviors are tried, they're experimented, and then they're fine-tuned. So just before puberty, children's growth patterns switch towards growing from the center outward, which is known as proximo-distal. And often you can observe that teens are more awkward or described as clumsy. And so with this fits within that proximal distal growth, in that they're not used to the growth in their arms or their legs, and so they may be clumsy or more awkward. And what we also see that are governing newborn and infant mobility are their reflexes. And so reflexes are automatic and built-in reactions to stimuli that do not have to transmit information all the way to the brain. And once sensed, these messages or information are only sent to the spinal cord. And this is particularly adaptive, as these behaviors are related to keeping the baby safe and fed. And reflexes are the building blocks for purposeful motor activity later in development. For example, different types of reflexes include the sucking reflex, which is characterized as the baby automatically sucking on an object placed on their mouth, or the Moro reflex, which is a startle response, where the baby will arch his or her back, throw their head back, and throw out their arms and legs, that then bring them toward their center. So this may occur in response to a loud noise or light, and disappears around when the baby is 3 to 4 months. And this reflex is useful for catching oneself when falling. Lastly, we also see a grasping reflex, in which the baby curls their fingers around something that's placed in their hands or their palm. So this reflex disappears around 3 months and is replaced by voluntary grasping, guided by their increased visual acuity. So motor development follows a steady progression of increasingly complex and coordinated movements, and language development is even more amazing. So there's quite a bit of difference between individuals and their progression through these specific motor milestones. And although someone may be ahead at one time, they may not be necessarily ahead later. Significantly, infants do not have to hit every single milestone. For example, they can skip crawling altogether. With infants, there is a motivation to move that equals finding solutions to problems or meeting their goal of reaching an object, for example. So infants are actively exploring their environment and learning from their experiences. And this is why we have recommendations for infants to have tummy time, to develop those muscles, and to encourage motor development, and the reason for having mobiles over the baby's crib or over them when they're laying on the floor. So not only do these help to distract the baby or help them keep them entertained, it also helps with encouraging their motor development by having babies reaching for objects or developing those muscles. So as we mentioned earlier, infants have this motivation to move, and their behaviors are tried, they're experimented with, and then they're fine-tuned to what is most efficient and most effective at reaching their goal. And new movements equal the combination of neural and muscular development, goal-oriented behavior, motivation to achieve the goal, and environmental supports from parents, for example. And in terms of fine motor skills, infants have little control at birth, but they are now developing and strengthening those building blocks that lead to fine motor skills. And across motor development, there are also cultural practices which have been found to lead to variations from typical motor milestones that we may see. And so some practices accelerate motor development, like practices shown in the picture of mothers in Mali who use exercise with their infants, while others may stifle or slow down motor development, such as some cultures in Paraguay who carry their infants for 3 years. And switching gears, the chapter also discusses Piaget's theory of cognitive development. And so the first period is the sensorimotor period, which lasts from about birth to 2 years of age. And in stage 1, there's particular stages that are broken down within the sensorimotor period. And in stage 1, reflexes are activated and modified, generalizing and discriminating simultaneously. And in other words, the sucking, gasping, or grasping, not gasping, looking do not remain reflexes as infants spontaneously do these behaviors. And given this, infants are developing schemes in the way that they are organizing patterns of behavior, strengthening, generalizing, and differentiating their behavior. And during the second stage, there is a rapid development of schemes and circular reaction where their behavior is repeated over and over again and becomes circular. So it's as if they need to figure out what parts they have and what they should do with them first and how to actually move them, and then they start acting directly on their environment. And so that's what you're starting to see through these first couple of stages. And the third stage is where infants are oriented to the external world or their environment. For example, you can see in the picture this little kiddo is shaking a rattle. They may be slapping or swatting at things, and so again, they're orienting themselves to the environment around them. They learn that there are environmental consequences of actions and are particularly interested in this type of behavior. So their schemes are now a little more refined to integrating their vision and their grasp. In this stage, cognitive structures are becoming increasingly integrated and organized. In stage 4, infants combine schemes in complex ways. And so this is where planning and intentionality emerge, and now their behavior is made up of instrumental and goal behavior. And so what this means is it's a type of means and behavior applied to new situations, and schemes are now mobile. And now infants can use instruments and objects to attain a goal, such as for example, using a hanger to reach a toy that is on the other side of the floor. So they use the hanger to now obtain their goal of getting that ball that was once out of their reach. So we also see the A not B error, which is typical of 8 to 12-month-olds. That is this tendency to search for an object at the original location, even after they've seen it being moved to a new location. So it's easy to hide an object or distract them by moving the object. This is also why peekaboo is fun with children during this stage. And in stage 5, children deliberately vary their actions and to see its effect on the outcome by trial and error exploration. And so this is an extension of that means in behavior of the previous stage to develop new means. In stage 5, thinking becomes covert when it was previously overt or open to observation. So it's now through an internal mental exploration where they generate novel solutions to problems using these mental representations. So children now have full object permanence anywhere from 18 to 24 months. And they have the ability to visualize information mentally. For example, they would be able to follow through with a simple command of bring me the broom from the closet. whereas before they wouldn't be able to have that mental representation of where they actually need to go to that location and find it and then bring it back. So also during this stage, we see pretend play explode. And so looking back on Piaget's theory, the skills he described all developed much earlier than he originally predicted. For example, he described object permanence occurring at about 8 months, when in reality, we typically see it as early as 3 to 4 months. And on this slide, all of these baby mammals are intensely social, and we're switching gears to talking about language development. And all of these animals are capable of learning communicative information that helps them communicate with other members in their species. And in fact, the social context and requirements of chimpanzees and gorillas are so similar to our own that they are capable of learning sign language. And dissimilar to us, they lack proper equipment to speak as we do. So the human vocal system has been selected for spoken language and allows for communication over long distances in the dark, and so on and so forth. So apes do not spontaneously learn sign language, however. Once they are taught by humans, they will actually spontaneously teach it to their offspring. And with language development at the forefront, the brains of infants and children are called the greatest learning machine in the universe. That this learning machine that we have is designed to acquire, process, and store data. We use it to make sense of the world and also to help us function. And so language helps with all of these functions. Because we are such a social species, our brains are designed to process information in the social realm easily, efficiently, and quickly. And language not only helps us to communicate, but also helps us to think. So we can relate ideas to one another and also use it to help remember or help us to communicate ultimately. So one particular theory describing language development is the Nativist Theory. And this theory talks about that we are biologically programmed to acquire language. And the biggest proponent of this view is Noam Chomsky, and he believed that language is too complex to simply be learned by imitation or trial and error. So thus children have this inborn language acquisition device, or LAD, and he believed that this was an inborn linguistic processor that is activated by verbal input. And according to Chomsky, the LAD has a knowledge of rules that are common across all languages, and this is known as universal grammar. So regardless of the language, the LAD should permit any child to understand most of what they hear if they have developed a vocabulary and an understanding of proper rules. So considering this theory, you may ask, what support is there for this nativist position? And so there are linguistic universals where children worldwide reach certain milestones at the same age. Even children with an intellectual disability acquire near-normal understanding of syntax, and this is specific to our species. So other animals communicate, and apes can learn sign language at about a 2 and 2.5 year level, but only humans develop spontaneous language. Additional support for this theory include the Broca and Wernicke's area, and these are two areas of the brain that, when injured, result in aphasia or a loss of language functions. Specifically, damage to Broca's area results in speech production problems, whereas damage to Wernicke's area results in problems with comprehending language. And at birth, speech sounds elicit more electrical activity in the left side of the brain. In essence, what we're seeing is that these areas are essentially pre-programmed for acquiring language, and thus supports this nativist position. We also see sensitive periods in which the idea that most speech is learned before puberty. So case studies with individuals like Jeannie, who was severely neglected and isolated, and Chelsea, who was deaf and raised in isolation, could learn words but never truly mastered syntax, which other sociable children just picked up. So they missed that particular window or time period to learn or acquire that language. Criticism for this position include the phonemic distinctions apparent in other animals. So just because human infants can discriminate between phonemes is no longer so compelling, because other animals have demonstrated that they can also discriminate as well. Others argue that the nativist approach is just a general description of language, but it really doesn't help to explain how it happens. We also see that parents or the baby's environment have the ability to reinforce the sounds they want to hear, like mama. And so typically when that happens, parents are very excited. They praise the baby. They essentially light up in front of the baby, and so they're reinforcing that behavior, and also other nonsense type sounds, which is a learned behavior and not natural. So what we also see within this particular chapter is another theory of language development, which is the Interactionist Theory. And this theory posits that there is a biological and also environmental influence that help to interact with one another and determine the course of the individual's language development. So the biological part is made up of the interactionist belief that humans are biologically prepared to acquire a language, but not because we have a language acquisition device, but because we have a continually developing brain. Universals are explained by being in the same species. And the environmental part is made up of the interactionist, stressing that language is primarily a means of communicating that develops in the context of social interactions with other people. So we communicate with others to meet our basic needs, our need for developing and maintaining relationships, and so on. So language development is likely a mixture of both biological and environmental influences and results in language development. So we see that there's varying development, and for infants, their language involves babbling and other vocalizations. And so babies have the ability to cry immediately from birth. And so they start to babble about 4 to 6 months and may make sounds like mama or papa, but these words really don't have any meaning behind them yet. And this happens universally and even for children who are deaf, suggesting that maturation is at play. We also see babies recognizing language sounds by about 6 months of age, and during this stage, infants have started to specialize in the speech sounds of their native language. And what the child understands is considerably more than they can produce. Like when learning a new language, it's easier to listen and comprehend than to come up with cohesive sentences on your own. And what we see with this particular language development in infancy is that spoken language or spoken vocabulary begins at about 10 to 15 months. During the first months or so, they are only producing about 10 words a month. By age 2 years, toddlers can speak about 200 words, and this is where they have a language explosion. Toddlers typically start to have 2-word utterances at about 18 to 24 months, and you can also observe 2 common errors in their language. So one is overextension, where all four-legged creatures are doggy, and underextension, where bottle only refers to their favorite bottle, not all or any other bottles of milk or water, and so on. Here, children in many, if not most parts of the world, are learning more than one language, usually their native language plus English. And in terms of being bilingual and whether that hinders or helps, early studies showed that bilingual children were delayed in language development. However, most of these studies were done on first-generation immigrant families who were typically low socioeconomic status, and therefore there were multiple confounds in the studies. In these particular set of studies, it did not account for age, nutrition, quality of education, if at all. And so this ultimately affected policies set by lawmakers and educators who discouraged bilingualism back in the 20th century. And so researchers influenced by the Nativist perspective began to look more carefully at the process of learning two languages at once. Findings included that children who were exposed before the age of 3 to two different languages had little difficulty becoming proficient at both languages. Bilingual toddlers occasionally mixed their phonologies and grammatical structure of the languages, but by age 3 did not make these errors and discriminated well between both languages. And at age 4, they were proficient at both, provided that they had sufficient exposure to the second language. And studies that matched bilingual children on age and socioeconomic status found a number of cognitive advantages to bilingualism, such as higher IQ, that these children were better able to think about the process of language and to detect grammatical errors. And they were also better on non-linguistic tasks that require selective attention and their ability to overcome distraction. So there has been a controversy, particularly within education, that's especially in places where demographics are changing, and whether implementing immersion types of schooling is appropriate or not, or if it should be encouraged or not. And so that really seems to extend beyond education and even developmental psychology and into more of a social psychology context of people's arguments against well-executed bilingual schools who show an advantage in both English language and also other academics that last well into middle school.